having to take. Oh, Denny's already on there. That's nice.
Oh,
You
And I
better
have-
just turn it over to him.
okay, I am going to, boom. Wait a second, did I do that right?
You just started the recording.
Yeah, I started the recording. I got to get back over here, and what I want to do is start the share screen. And our initial share is this one. Welcome to the Southern Trails chapter of the Oregon-California Trails Association. That name is almost as long as our chapter's representation is all the way from California to Arkansas. So we're doing these talks once a month so that we have something going that brings us together a little bit. And you can see the trails that are our interest as a chapter. And boy, there we go. And I think all of you are already members. If you're not, this is basically the membership form. I can email that out to you if you ask me to, or you can get it at OCTA at INDEPMO, independencemissouri.org. And boom. Benefits of being in Southern Trails include twice a year getting Desert Tracks, which is a first-rate journal. And for more information or a brochure, you can contact me if you like. This one's easy to remember, Doug at DougHawking.com. Okay, and and that's an easy email address to remember. And there again, there is our the Overland Journal. You get that 4 times a year, as well as Desert Tracks twice a year. And we'll stop the share for a second. Hello, Gary. Glad to see you here. And I'm going to go to the other show. There we go. Grant Wheeler and Joe George, Cochise County Cowboys Extraordinaire. They cowboyed, they rodeoed, and they robbed trains. If you know anything about Cochise County Cowboys, you understand this is a perfectly natural thing to do. There we go. Cochise County. Why? I looked into all of the train robberies on the Southern Corridor, and the Southern Corridor is what we're interested in as a chapter. The Gadsden Purchase was purchased so that we'd be able to put through the railroad, the 32nd degree corridor, or as we think of it today, the I-10 corridor. And it runs right through Cochise County, as the railroad did, and as the trails did. So what have we got down here that, well, I looked into the train robberies, and there was something like 16 of them, like Dirty Harry. I kind of lost count after a while. Every time I thought I'd found them all, someone had mentioned another one. And almost all of them come back to Cochise County one way or another. So why Cochise County? Well, we've got borders. 2 counties, 2 states. Actually, we have our own 4 corners down here: Chihuahua, Sonora, New Mexico, and Arizona come together. It's easy to jump jurisdictions. You can see on my map Steens. Steens is a little tiny nothing of a town. 3 holdups. They grab the train at Steens where there was no law and tell them, take it to Cochise County. or Cuba or someone. Now, Cochise County. And then they'd rob the train in Cochise County, 100 miles away from the Cochise County Sheriff and 60 miles away from the sheriff in Grant County, New Mexico. Easy to cross jurisdictions and confuse the law. We've got mountains to hide in. We have the Southern Corridor. And I'll come back to that. But the fact that we had a train meant that there was wealth on the move. We've got Tombstone, Bisbee, Silver City, all of which were major players back around the turn of the 19th to 20th century. They were shipping gold and silver out to the mints. The mines got smart. We'll make ingots that weigh 60 pounds, too big to put in a saddlebag, but it had to come back as coins to pay the miners. And so outlaws would try and hold up the incoming payroll. And one more thing we've got is Texas exiles. The trail herds came up and ended in Cochise County, bringing cattle from Texas for the reservations and the army. A lot of the guys who left Texas with these things were not wanted in Texas, which is to say the sheriff wanted them and no one else did. And they would get up here and get paid off. And then they would spend their money on wine, women, song, and gambling and totally waste the rest of it. And then they had no money to get back to Texas, even if they could go. So what did they do? Well, they became rustlers, worked at a job they already knew, and the towns like Bisbee and Tombstone and Silver City needed cheap meat. Some of them a little smarter than the others, perhaps, would rustle a few head and start their own ranch. And so we had a lot of ranchers that were friendly to the other rustlers. And when robbing cattle became not so popular, they started hitting stagecoaches. And when they ran out of stagecoaches, they hit the trains. Like I said earlier, 16 robberies at least. And there's poor Steens with 3 of them. Others have noticed that there was something special about this corner of Arizona. The Republic in 1910 said there was something special. Virgil Earp thought it might be the population down here. I've mentioned the jurisdictions. And that brings us to the idea of how do you rob a train? Definitely not the way you see it in the movies. You don't ride up behind the train and jump on the back. If you didn't kill yourself, you probably found the horse unwilling to run along the ties and over the gravel and get near that hideous big monster. And even if you did, you were at the wrong end of the train. You didn't jump on from a bridge or a deep cut. Looks great in the movies, but if you don't kill yourself in the process, now you're fighting smoke and cinders as you run along the top of the train to the cab. Believe it or not, I watched Audie Murphy do both of these in a movie recently. The other thing you don't do is stick up the passengers. The passengers typically haven't got enough money. A lot of them have guns. This doesn't mean that they weren't frightened that they'd be held up, but it just took too many people to control them. And that meant you had to split the loot more ways. And we get wonderful stories of people hiding their valuables in their shoe, under the seat, in the overhead luggage rack, in the stove, in the toilets, anywhere that came to mind. So what did you do? Well, you could dig up the track. Excuse me. You could dig up the track. It was dangerous. The engine was probably going to go over on its side, killing the fireman and the engineer. And they might spot it before they got to it. And what's more, it's too much like work. You're an outlaw. You don't want to work. You know? So if you knew a little bit about railroad operations, you could signal the train to stop. 3 torpedoes on the track. These are small explosive charges like a firecracker. If you didn't have a torpedo, a bullet would do. The train rolls over 1, boom, danger ahead. Boom, boom, slow down. Boom, 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 stop. And you wave a red lantern, which says stop, there's danger ahead, or the engineer might read it as there's a house of ill repute ahead, and either way, he was likely to stop. You could board the train in town, which they did at Steen's over and over. But of course, there was danger that law enforcement would spot you. Or you could ride the blind baggage. That is the end of the baggage car that didn't have a window or door, and therefore was blind, and it was right behind the tender. This is where deadheads, hobos, would ride. And outlaws rode there too. And amazingly, the trains were organized to make this convenient for outlaws. You had the engine, the tender, the baggage car, and then the express car, which is what you were after, and then finally the passenger cars. Why would the railroads make this so convenient for outlaws? Well, I found that out not too long ago, riding an old-time train. Here I am between the cars taking pictures, blinking smoke and hot cinders out of my eyes. I looked back, and behind us, about a half a mile behind, was a utility vehicle on the tracks with a very large fire extinguisher, putting out the fires we were starting. You go back and read in the 19th century, the railroads are complaining that the Indians are starting fires behind the trains in an effort to destroy the railroad. Right, they're starting fires behind the train. Yeah, that's going to work. They admitted that now and then they started the fires. And that brings us to our heroes. Grant Wheeler was truly the hero of 1894. He appears over and over again in the newspapers. The first time in January, when he was racing Sherman Clump's bay horse, Bunk. Now, you all know how that horse got his name, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cowboys sitting around the campfire arguing, I got the fastest horse. The next one goes, no, I got the fastest horse. No, it's my horse. And the other two turn on him and go, that's Bunk. And he says, you're darn right. My horse is Bunk. He's the fastest. Okay. In February, Grant got injured. He pulled his shoulder out of its joint, ended up in the hospital in Tombstone, handing out photographs of himself to all the pretty nurses. Now, can you imagine this was a newspaper item? How many of you know a cowboy that has more than 3 fingers? If you know cowboys, you know they're injured all the time. Well, he gets injured and they're afraid he won't be able to rope in the rodeo anymore. And so this is news. He recovers. In August, he wins a race riding on Bunk, the fastest horse. It's September. He was trying out his shoulder. He bought a brand new lariat and rode around Wilcox until he found a Chinese dishwasher. And he roped that dishwasher to try out the lariat, and the dishwasher pulled his knife and cut the lariat to pieces. Grant threatened him. The Chinese went for a gun. Grant went and got his gun, and they both got arrested for displaying guns in town. $50 fine. In October at Roundup, I have a hard time imagining that the bosses allowed this, but they were drinking, and the Cowboys got to arguing, probably about who had the fastest horse. And then Grant came out with the announcement that, I'm getting tired of cowboying. And when I give it up, I think I know what I'll do. I'll rob trains, and I know just how I'll do it. And this led to an argument, and pretty soon one of the bosses, Cy Bryant, said, I better break that up before somebody gets hurt. So he ran over to break it up, and Grant pulled his gun and shot him in the belly. Not waiting to see the result, he hopped on a horse and rode away. He would learn 2 weeks later that Cy had not only survived, but was in good shape. The bullet had gone in, skidded across his belly muscles, and out the other side, doing very little damage. And they made bosses tough in those days. I mean, seriously. So in November, Grant turned himself in and was released on bail. In January, Grant and his buddy, Joe George, decided to ride as deadheads in the blind baggage. They hopped on the train in Wilcox and were almost immediately detected by the train crew. They offered him $1 to take him as far as Dragoon Summit. Either that wasn't enough, or the train men were honest, or they didn't trust each other. Whatever, they said, nope, ain't gonna do it. So Joe and Grant pulled their guns and escorted the crew back to the locomotive. Now this alerted everyone in Wilcox. The train's being robbed. Everyone in town knew except one person. Sheriff C.S. Fly was in town. Yeah, the photographer, the famous photographer. He did a stint as Cochise County Sheriff. In Wilcox, they probably thought it unsporting to tell the sheriff that the train was being robbed. Now, we all know from the movies that there are lots of horses, fat, sassy, well-fed, with a rifle in the boot, tied up at the hitching rail in town, right? No, hardly anybody in town keeps a horse. It's expensive, it's smelly. They go to the livery stable. Fly couldn't find a horse. The train was pulling out of town, so Fly pursued on foot for over a mile. Meanwhile, the boys had the train taken out into the Wilcox Playa. And there they stopped and had the passenger cars disconnected. The express agent, who had been robbed recently, recognized that something was going on. So he shoved all the loose money in his pockets, locked up all the safes, jumped off the express car, locking the door behind him, and took off running back toward Wilcox, perhaps hoping to meet Sheriff Fly. The boys took the train another 2 miles out, and there they stopped. And being thoughtful souls, they sent the firemen back to tell the passengers in the passenger cars, no need to worry. If you don't interfere with us, we won't hurt you. They then went to the express car and put a gun to the engineer's head and said, open up or we'll blow his head off. The express agent, being well on his way back to Wilcox, didn't hear them. They didn't kill the engineer. They blew the door off the car. Inside, they found 8,000 pesos and 1,000 peso sacks. They did not value these at all. Apparently, you needed about a ton of them to be worth anything. So they used them to tamp the explosion, and they blew open the safe, and they blew up the express car, and they blew pesos all over the playa. We were still finding them in the 1960s. The Mexican population of Wilcox came out to collect them the next day. But the boys got into the safe. They had made a serious error, however. They had annoyed the Southern Pacific and Wells Fargo. They destroyed Wells Fargo's safe and blown up the Southern Pacific's express car. So there were soon huge rewards out for their capture. 5 posses pursued them all over Cochise County, and not one person would rat them out. No, the boys got wined and dined. They killed the fatted calf for them wherever they went. These were rodeo heroes. And they had just done the Southern Pacific. In the early 90s, we had a terrible drought down here. And folks tried to sell their cattle. They tried to ship them to other ranges so that they wouldn't overgraze. And the Southern Pacific, in order to help out, raised the rate 25%. This meant that if someone wanted to sell their cattle, they actually had to pay them to take them off their hands. The cattle were worth less than the cost of shipping. So everybody loved the Southern Pacific at this point. Now, the ranchers, in their own defense, say, well, we're on an isolated ranch. Here come armed outlaws. We have to cooperate or they'll kill us. Yeah, but after they leave, you might tell the posse. They didn't. To the boys' misfortune, they were also pursued by Billy Breckenridge. Breckenridge, who had been Sheriff Behan's deputy back when the Earps were in town. He was actually a fairly tough lawman and working for the Southern Pacific. You remember Billy from the movie Tombstone, right? Yeah, that's him over there. Anyway, he's now a tough outlaw, and he doesn't have much use for Thacker, the famed detective from Wells Fargo. He left off company with Thacker. Thacker had these wild plans. He was going to get a bottle of drugged alcohol to the boys, and when they passed out, he'd go in and tie them up. The boys found out about that from their friends, and they laughed at him. He said, you might as well catch birds by putting salt on their tails. Billy got himself a copy of that picture that Grant had been distributing. Anyway, we want you to know that Grant and Joe were an inspiration to others. In 1895, they robbed the Southern Pacific on the Wilcox Playa. 4 years later, blowing up the express car. 4 years later, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid would blow up their own express car on a Union Pacific train. And we know it was inspiration and not mere coincidence because they did it at Wilcox, Wyoming, a tribute to Grant and Joe. The boys rode around the county until February 25, and then they would reemerge at Steen's. Steen's started out as a quarry for the railroad where they got ballast for the tracks. Then the railroad figured out that they needed a water point about there. But there was no water. Steen's Pass had been avoided by the 49ers and by the wagon trains because it was waterless and the water was too deep to drill. So the railroad brought it in by tanker car. And now that there was a water source, we had a town grow up. It had a train station and a telegrapher's office and a mercantile store and a hotel with saloon and an outhouse. But no law officers. The nearest was way off 60 miles in Silver City. And the outlaws went in there and over cards, they went, wow, this is our kind of town. And so Grant and Joe went there. They were the first to hop on the train. They went up to the engineer and said, disconnect them cars and take this train to Cochise County. And so he did. Now, we've already noted that nobody bothered the passengers. I couldn't find a single one holdup where they actually went after the passengers, and it turned out 3 of the passengers were armed deputies, but we won't go there for now. Normally, they didn't molest the passengers. Nonetheless, the passengers thought that they would come after them. They hid under the seats. They hid in the overhead luggage racks. They hid their valuables. One man claimed to be a hero. He told the press all about how he'd run up and down, encouraging people to hide. When they finally got to Tucson, other folks went, yeah, not so much. Anyway, out in the San Simon Valley, the boys handed 2 gunny sacks to the engineer and said, fill these with gravel and rock. The engineer, wanting to cooperate in solidarity with the outlaws, okay, he began doing that. But after a while, curiosity got the better of him. And he looked up at the outlaws and said, why am I doing this? We're going to use that to tempt the explosion when we blow the safe. But we don't have a safe in the cab. No, silly, the one in the express car. But you told me to leave that back at Steen's. And at this point, the boys saw the enormity of their error. And they proceeded to cuss. They never repeated themselves once. They never descended into the scatological or gynecological, sticking to the purely biblical. They cussed that railroad from the president through the board of directors, down through the engineers, brakemen, firemen, even the poor Pullman porters got it. Then they went back and cussed the rails, the cross ties, the sidings, and the spur lines all the way from San Francisco to New Orleans. And they went back and started on the rolling stock before they ran out of steam. They then disappeared into the brush where they had waiting horses, leaving behind a wide-eyed engineer who believed he just attended a fire and brimstone spiritual revival. Unfortunately for the boys, Billy Breckenridge was on their trail, and he had a photo. He distributed that and learned that the boys had gone to Cortez, Colorado. So he pursued them to Cortez, where he found out they'd gone to Durango. So he pursued them to Durango, where he found out they'd gone to Farmington. In Farmington, he learned they'd gone to Shiprock. And in Shiprock, he learned they'd gone back to Cortez. And at this point, rumor was they'd gone into Utah to the mountains. He headed toward Durango to pick up his friend, the sheriff. And in Mancos, he stopped and showed the picture around. And a rancher's wife said, "Yeah, I've seen those guys before. They come into the saloon every night to get drunk." So Billy waited for them outside the saloon, and they didn't come. The next day, he headed out to the Arroyo, where they were rumored to be camped. And sure enough, Grant stuck his head up out of the Arroyo and looked at him, saw the posse, and headed back down. Now, none of the posse members wanted to be the first to stick their head over the edge and get it blown off. While they argued about who was to be the first, they heard a shot. Now they really didn't want to go. After a while, they finally went to take a look, and they found Grant's dead body, shot in the head. It was unclear whether Grant had simply wanted to avoid the noose, or if Joe had shot him as a way of discouraging and slowing the posse. We understand that Joe was a really nasty fellow, so it's possible. Well, this ended Grant's career in train robbery. And Joe, well, according to legend, he died a few weeks later trying to pull off a robbery down in Mexico with only $20 in his pocket. And that's the story of Grant and Joe. I have put together a book, which my publisher wants to call Train Robberies of the Southwest, which isn't exactly accurate because I stuck to the Gadsden Purchase from El Paso to Yuma. But hey, don't argue with the publisher. They want the manuscript in December. The manuscript is ready, so I'm going to send it in a few days. We'll see if they'll go ahead and publish it sooner. Had a lot of fun writing it, and it, like the story of Grant and Joe, there's a lot of really dark humor in it. I mean, either the outlaws were doing something outrageous or the posses were. On 2 occasions, the entire posse got arrested, if you can imagine. You know, in one case for kidnapping. So, yeah. Any questions?
What was that railroad you were writing, Doug?
Oh, that is the, okay. The Toltec, and Deborah, help me out here. Cumbres and Toltec Railroad that runs from Chama over to Antonito, Colorado. And that railroad used to run from Alamosa to Antonito to Chama, through Dulce, where I grew up, on to Durango, and then up to Silverton. But they took out the part between Durango and Chama. And now yeah.
Yeah, I've been on the Durango and Silverton Railroad, so that's all part of the same. That was all part of the same original railroad. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Boy, that's a pretty railroad then.
Yeah. What was fun when we wrote it, we were still under mask discipline in New Mexico and not in Colorado. And the train goes back and forth between Colorado and New Mexico about 20 times. And the train crew says, "We have to tell you, but we ain't going to worry about it."
Great. Good job, Doug.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Interesting.
Thanks.
Where were the mints? Where was the mint for that? You talked about the fact that they
Oh,
smelted
oh,
the gold
there
and
was
put
a
it in
mint in,
ingots.
there was a mint in Denver and a mint in San Francisco. From down here, the rail ran to San Francisco. It was harder to get to Denver
Uh-huh.
because the intermediate lines hadn't been completed. So,
So they ship the ingots all the way out to San Francisco and then bring the gold coins, you said, back from San Francisco. Huh?
yeah, well, you know, you couldn't make coins down here very well. And
Uh,
printing your own paper money after the Civil War could get you in trouble. So, but the railroad came up with the idea of the through safe. The through safe, the express messenger didn't have a key. And anything large amounts of cash that were going long distance, the keys would be in Los Angeles, San Francisco, El Paso. And they constantly tried to catch the payroll, and the guys, the railroad outsmarted them almost every time. It would come days or a week early, or they would ship it to a different town and then take it by wagon. All very secretive.
Good story.
Yeah, excellent presentation.
Well, thanks, Dr. Miller.
You bet, anytime.
How to read the book.
Yeah.
Now, I've got a list of speakers that I know have given good talks on the subject, the Southern Rails and Southern Rails, Southern Quarter, Southern Trails. This month I got kind of caught up. Somebody suggested someone, and he kept putting me off because he really didn't want to do it until it was too late to get anyone else. So I thought, okay, well, I got one of these things in the background you might like.
Good choice.
Well, I see a few folks have dropped out, and I appreciate your coming. Are there any more questions before I shut it down?
What's next on the agenda?
Well, tomorrow I'll try and figure out who I'm going to tap. I've been way behind. I'm just out of the Tucson Festival of Books where I saw Gary Seiss. He stopped by our booth. I run a booth for 8 authors, and I get to do all the accounting. So we spent Monday figuring out everybody's share and writing their checks and trying to recover from being on our feet 2 solid days. Well, 3 really, if you count setup. But a great weekend in other ways. In the afternoon, we went over to the Southern Arizona Transportation Museum. Have any of you been there? It's in Tucson on Toole, which is where the railroad station is. Little tiny museum. They have a statue of Doc and Wyatt shooting that outlaw at the station. They have an engine on display that they'll let you go up into. They'll show you how to operate it. And then they have the museum itself. Well, I got in the museum and I said, hey, can I use your pictures in my book? And they took the pictures out of the frames and off the wall, and we hand scanned them all. And well, how much do you guys want for this? No, it's okay. You know, just mention where you got them. These are some great guys. And they actually came by the booth and bought a few books. So That was fun. But exhausting. So now I can start thinking about other projects. I spent today working on judging novels for a contest. I won't tell you which one or what the category is, but I'm getting a lot of books that seem like they might be Western romance novels. And in the one novel, this French woman spends all her time changing her clothes. I got to wear one dress for breakfast and another one for mid-morning and another for lunch. Oh, yeah. I'm going to need a testosterone shot when I'm done. Yeah. So anyway, it's fun reading, believe it or not. Anyway, with that, unless someone has something else, I'll go ahead and shut us down.
I look forward to the book.
Okay.
Me too.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Doug. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Take care, guys. I hope you enjoyed.